Let me take you to a cold, black mountainside, where men with faces the color of stone climbed into the wind and chose silence over comfort, risk over rest, and a cliff over a road. If you want to understand how an underdog brigade stunned a confident enemy, start with the sound of breath, slow, controlled, practiced, rising into the pine air like it's asking permission to keep going. NTHE year is 1943. The place, southern Italy. The enemy has built a winter wall called the Bernhardt Line, stones and steel wrapped around mountains with names that taste like old monasteries: Camino, Defensa, Remitania, roads twist, valleys funnel. Every approach is a rifle barrel pointed at you. Allied units have tried to break this chain by daylight, with battalions smashing uphill into machine guns that see everything. The results: frozen, costly stalemate. And then, on a map crowded with divisions, someone draws a small black arrow up a sheer escarpment no sane planner would choose, and writes a unit name in letters, so new the paper doesn't believe them yet. 1st Special Service Force. Non-paper, it isn't even a brigade. It's a misfit miracle. American and Canadian volunteers welded into a single formation, created for a mission that vanished, kept alive by a stubborn colonel, and the belief that hard training can turn strangers into a blade. They come from farms, mines, factories, sawmills, city streets. They speak with prairie vowels and Montreal consonants. They are skiers, hunters, carpenters, mechanics, wrestlers, men whose hands already know what friction is and how to make it a friend. Their training made them unpopular and unbreakable. They ran ridiculous distances with rifles that felt heavier on purpose. They climbed ropes until the palms bled, then climbed ropes again. They learned to move as if darkness were daylight, to shoot without argument between brain and trigger, to carry more than was fair and call it Tuesday. They learned mountain work from instructors who used cliffs as classrooms. They practiced taking a knife out of its shy sheath only when it improved outcomes for everyone wearing your patch. They were given a nickname by the Germans later, Black Devils, and it stuck because the enemy rarely bothers to nickname you unless you've earned the favor. Now the map says Monte la Defensa, a spike of limestone that stares down the road to Rome. German paratroopers of the Hermann Göring Division sit on its cap like a king on a throne, dug in, wired in, zeroed in. Every switchback below is registered. Every scrub patch has a number beside it. Every approach that normal armies use ends in machine gun geometry. The winter weather is on the enemy's side. Snow dusts the rock, cold stiffens fingers, and wind steals heat from the neck like a thief who prefers their work honest. NTHE plan the force proposes is almost rude in its simplicity. Don't go where the enemy's guns point. Go where rocks point. Scale the unscalable on a night the weather hates, appear on the crest at dawn from a direction the defenders have not remembered since childhood, and bring enough quiet violence in your backpacks to rewrite the rules. There is skepticism. There is always skepticism when someone suggests turning a cliff face into a road. But the mission is approved because occasionally, in war, the mad thing is the merciful thing if it ends days of dying at the wrong angle. NSO, now we are here. The night before the climb, the men sit in a tree line far below the skyline, cold soaked into the knees through wool. They speak in murmurs that are more breath than word. Straps are checked again, because straps must carry what pride can't. A man rewraps his hands with friction tape, the way a boxer wraps his wrists, ritual like armor. Another rubs resin on his palms for grip. Resin smells like pine and confidence. Knives are dull where they should be dull and sharp where they must be sharp. Ammunition is distributed as if faith could be counted. Each man balances the heaviest sentence he has ever carried. Up. The route looks from below like the inside edge of a broken tooth, vertical, jagged, indifferent. The escarpment rises 600, 800 feet. There are goat paths that end in air, ledges so narrow your shoulder blades memorize the stone, And in places where rock becomes exaggeration, there are fixed ropes the sappers drove into cracks earlier with leaves shoved on them so the enemy wouldn't see a new line drawn by human hands. NTHE order moves down the file with the softness of a prayer. Stand. Single file. Hands on shoulders. No talking. Move. Boots slide into the first slope. The line becomes a living thing. Slow, flexible, disciplined, almost tidal. Every 10 steps, someone gently taps the heel of the man ahead, just to say, I'm here. The mountain steals that message and echoes it back in small, harmless rocks that tick down into the dark. Each tick is a sermon on gravity. The NH halfway up, the wind makes a suggestion to go home. It becomes an argument at the 3/4 mark. At one traverse, a man's pack scrapes limestone and a shower of sparks rings tiny bells along the cliff. Everyone stops breathing. No shots. The wind returns to its insults. The climb goes on. End time stops being a number. It becomes a list of decisions. Where to put a foot you cannot see. Where to put a hand you hope will find a truth. When to tell your thigh to stop lying about fire. The cold asks to sit inside your chest. You say no without words. Above, shadow is geometry. Below, the valley is the rumor you left behind. Somewhere behind your sternum, a small metronome keeps time, counting in, counting out. The mountain says you're not invited. The men insist on attendance anyway. There is a problem at the crux. There is always a problem at the crux. A stretch of rock smooth as a lie, too far for normal reach, too narrow for a ladder, too loud for a hammer. A sergeant named for a bird inches out until the mountain owns his boots and not his spine, finds a crack that is more idea than fact, and drives a piton with taps that are more heartbeat than hammer. The line moves again, an inch at a time, 30 men, 60, 100, until the rope is history and the ledge is memory. Later, that sergeant will shrug off the legend that tries to curl around his name. For now, he keeps moving, because moving is the antidote he's paid to carry. Near the summit rim, the pine becomes dwarf and the rock becomes sky. The lead elements belly onto a shelf, just shy of silhouette. They lie there like part of the mountain, hands under bodies, faces under rags, the way hunters lie in snow to become an absence. The rest stacked below them, silent patience in layers, until a whole brigade's worth of intent sits on a ledge meant for goats and angels. And dawn decides to work. It pours gray into black, then makes a decision to be color. Far below, the road shines with frost. Far ahead, within grenade throw, the German positions look like lumpy snow with bad habits. Machine gun pits camouflaged with branches. Dugouts with smoke stains disguised as shadows. Wire that thinks it learned invisibility from winter. A lieutenant whispers the first word a man ever learned that still matters. Now. They don't scream when they go in. They expand. Grenades arc like punctuation, the short, hard kind that ends arguments. Men step into pits and make strangers drop weapons by replacing the fiction of safety with a hand on a shoulder and a mouth that says something none of us need to hear right now. A machine gun stutters once, twice, then never again. A second one fails to draw breath. On the right, a Canadian from the prairies airs out a trench with such meticulous kindness, rifle step, that later someone will describe it as agriculture. On the left, the resistance is angry because surprise insults pride. An MG-42 wakes like a chainsaw and cuts air where men had been. 2 forcemen go down hard, one with a sound that makes other men read faster. The next 3 men sell flanks, the way drills say, 1 pin, 1 pry, 1 finish. The gun becomes scrap that pretends it was never dangerous. And a German officer appears in a dugout mouth, fatigue coat open, hat slightly wrong from sleep and shock. He reaches for a pistol because that is what pride tries to reach for when someone has stolen its map. He sees 20 men appear where he had been told cliffs would argue forever. His hand remembers how heavy consequences are. He raises the other hand. War is a machine that occasionally loves a gesture. Within minutes? 10? 15? Time glares and refuses to be counted. The cap of Monte la Defensa, that winter-proof throne, belongs to men whose method was simply to disbelieve the phrase, "cannot be done." Signal flares go up because sometimes you need to tell the world what you've earned. Down in the valley, officers lift binoculars and say words into radios that taste like disbelief and coffee. Now comes the part most stories skip, the day after the miracle. The force has the crest, but the crest is not a blanket, it's a roof without walls, and roofs without walls ask you to defend them in circles. The enemy is disciplined. They are angry, they counterattack, because that is what professionalism does when embarrassment arrives. Mortars start drawing lines in the air. Sniper rounds look for elbows. Artillery, never shy, tries to make gravity a collaborator again. NTHE Force answers with the dull, beautiful craft it learned in Montana, Alberta, and every mean training slope between. Dig, wire, sight, ration, rotate, and refuse. Men who were spiders on a cliff become carpenters of a fortress built in hours. They drop to knees and build parapets with their helmets, pass ammo like it's bread, pull their dead back with the tenderness of thieves rescuing a painting. Medics move like thoughts that hate noise. A chaplain crawls where he doesn't have to be and becomes exactly where he must be. NTHE first counterattack slams into the new angles of the problem and discovers a shape it hadn't prepared for. A second push probes the right and finds that willingness has already filled the gaps. The third never arrives. Pride is expensive to keep feeding. Logistics have opinions too. And then, as if the mountain wants to test whether victory can hold a pen, the weather decides to audition for the role of enemy. Sleet arrives, turned by wind into needles that stitch through wool and skin. The rock sweats cold. Hands go dumb. The hot ends of rifles burn warmth away. A man reaches for a canteen and finds ice threaded through the mouth. He laughs, because laughing does tiny magic with hopelessness. Relief elements climb in, breath tucked into scarves, eyes wide at the angle where their world changed. They pass along baselines and sacks of bread, water, dry socks, nothing more heroic than that, and nothing more necessary. A captain who looks younger than the job shakes hands with the men who did something the map had scolded them about and says thank you like he means it, because he does. And news walks faster than mules. Along the ridge, Allied battalions lift into motion because the unthinkable is now a Tuesday. La Gamitanea, the sister peak, feels a new kind of pressure. The Camino Massif begins to imagine life on a different side of history. In headquarters, a general places a pin in a new place and allows himself the indulgence of half a smile. On the German maps, a red annotation appears that translates to, "What is this unit?" NTHAT night. The forcemen hold under a sky that finally stops sending knives. They rotate into holes that fit 2 men and a story. They eat meals that make noise in the stomach like small songs. They strip socks off feet that discovered rivers inside boots and pull on dry ones that feel like forgiveness. They whisper about the climb and pretend to argue over whose pack was heaviest. They clean weapons with the reverence of a man cleaning a piano. NTHE's stunned enemy remains stunned because shock has a half-life. They do not see how a cliff became a road. They see only the cost of failing to imagine that cliffs can be roads. They will adjust. Good enemies always adjust. But the day has been bought, and that receipt doesn't vanish. And in the morning, when the sun yanks the frost into steam and the valley looks like a cauldron learning to behave, a small group from the force walks to the edge and looks down at the path they did not take. It is quiet there. The switchbacks lie polite and treacherous. You can see, in the mind's eye, where the kill zones were, how machine guns would have braided bullets into ropes of certainty, how mortars would have taught the air a language you don't want to speak. One man spits gently into the void, a little ceremony to thank gravity for its excellent service last night, and a photograph will be taken later. Not the glossy type with medals and posed smiles, but a field camera shot, faces half blurred by breath and fence wire grin, helmets dented into personal topography, eyes that have learned an idea they didn't know their bodies could write. If you looked at that photo out of context, you'd see tired men who had been cold all night. If you know the place, you see a cliff that discovered it was climbable. The force now has a reputation it didn't ask for, and will spend the rest of the war living up to. They will keep doing jobs that don't fit regular schedules. Sicily, Anzio, southern France, their patch will show up where planners need a miracle and a ledger that balances in blood and minutes instead of acres and weeks. Their stealth will be famous, their knife will become a symbol, their blackened faces a story the enemy tells to frighten itself into caution. NBUT, none of that exists yet on this morning. What exists is breath that doesn't hurt anymore, a hot tin cup passed hand to hand, fingerprints on stone where men refuse to be told what couldn't be done, and the realization that sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points is not a line, it's a refusal. As the rest of the front begins to move because of what happened in the dark, a corporal from the prairies writes his mother with fingers still raw. He doesn't mention cliffs. He doesn't mention grenades that ended arguments before the enemy could think up a counter-argument. He doesn't mention that for a few minutes he could see Rome with his eyes and fear with his teeth. He writes instead, "We did fine, don't worry. The boys here are good." That's the sentence Underdog brigades write when they've just rearranged a battlefield. "We did fine, don't worry. The boys here are good." NTHE enemy, stunned, and now politely furious, will try to take back what a night stole from them. The weather will help them. The mountain will try to become impartial again. The force will answer in the only language it cares to speak: work. And that's where we leave this first chapter, on a wind-bitten crest that used to be a sermon about impossibility and is now a paragraph about making options where none were printed. The men who climbed will spend the day proving they deserve to keep what they stole. The valley below will carry the news north. And on a wall map far away, a small black arrow that once looked ridiculous looks, suddenly, like the only line that made sense. Dawn broke like a thin plate, and the mountain tried to shake the men off it. NTHE wind came first, testing the seams of parkas and the will of fingers. Then the mortars, feeling for the new owners of the crest, working left to right with the patience of someone reading a page aloud. You could taste limestone dust and explosive grit, a chalky sweetness on the tongue. You could see each blast as a brief, dirty flower in the sleet. You could hear a man's name shouted without rank, which was how you knew this was a family now. Improvised, stubborn, and unwilling to leave. NTHE first counterattack formed below like a rumor and arrived like a test. German shapes moved low against the rock, faces smeared to match winter. Paratroopers who had learned their own hard lessons on cliffs and rooftops. They wanted the summit back, the way a man wants his keys when the door is locked and the night is getting colder. NTHE force answered with work. There was no magic now. Just rifles that were clean even when the world wasn't, fields of fire drawn with mittened hands, and voices that said very simple things at the right volume. 2 steps, hold, low, again. A machine gun piped and was silenced. A grenade answered and was told no. A private from Alberta, who had shaped boards in a sawmill, shaped a defense on a slope instead, measuring distance with his eyes and regret with his trigger finger. NA medic moved at a crawl that felt like defiance. He wore his Red Cross as if it were just another pocket. He bandaged a thigh that fought him, taped a hand that had decided to become a claw, and leaned into a man's ear to say the sentence all wounded men want first. "I've got you." Nearby, a chaplain with a face made for laughter held a helmet with both hands and kept it steady under the worst kind of rain. NTHE enemy pressed again. A second wave, slower and angrier, searched for the seam you always hoped the other side forgot to sow. They found a wire fence where there had been air yesterday. They found a trench where there had been wind. They found a line of men whose eyes said, "We climbed here to stay." The wave thinned, wavered, and went back to tell the valley bad news. Holding a miracle takes more work than making one. The force learned that by the hour, NTHE Weather wrote its own doctrine. Sleet needles stitched through wool, then froze into a crust that made sleeves armor and fingers strangers. You learned new ways to light a cigarette with a match that had opinions about the wind. You learned the taste of tinned meat eaten in 2 bites during a lull, the way the second bite felt like a favor from the universe. You learned that laughter found a way even when faces were too numb to smile, and that it sounded like a stove catching on the first try. By afternoon, the crest didn't look like a trophy anymore. It looked like a workshop. Men dug and revetted and stacked ammunition until the place felt like a plan. They dragged their dead as if carrying them out of weather, which in a way they were. They talked about home without naming it, and about food as if food were a friend coming up the trail. And from below, the enemy tried to find a story that ended differently. Artillery searched the crest with long, deliberate strokes, teaching the sky a bad vocabulary. Snipers wrote punctuation on anything that moved wrong. Mortars continued their lesson in random pain. But every hour the defense held, the mountain leaned a little more toward the men who'd stolen it. When the light went pale, afternoon conceding without grace, relief climbed in fits and starts, mules skidding, boots squealing against stone. They came with water that tasted like metal and love, with dry socks you could feel before you put them on, and with cans that steamed like hope. They were not poets, these carriers, but they could have written a religion around hot tea. A lieutenant with frost in his eyebrows shook hands with a sergeant whose hands were a map of rope burns, said, "Well done," like he was paying a debt, and meant it. NTHAT night was the longest because everyone had time to think. The force rotated by threes into holes no bigger than a conversation, breathing steam into shared air, promising each other out loud. "We're fine." They repaired what could be repaired, barrels, boots, courage, and deferred what couldn't. A pair of Canadians traded a chocolate bar for a handful of cartridges as if the exchange rate were sacred scripture. An American from the Dakotas wrote in a notebook with a pencil that had been whittled down to a righteous stub, "We are still here, still on top." Down in the valley, the map changed shape. The line that had looked like a wall softened into a suggestion. Other units looked up, measured what courage had purchased, and moved. Monte la Remitanea, sister to Defensa, with a face more sullen than sheer, felt a tension fall on its shoulders. The Camino Massif, a name that had been a curse for weeks, began to sound like a door with a key in it. And at first light, the mountain gave back color, green in a thorn bush, brown where boots had roughed the limestone, red where sleet had bled a man's knuckles, and he didn't bother to notice. And then the word came along the line that feels like permission when you've been the end of the map. Advance elements. Push to the next crease. They went again, not with the romance of the first climb, but with the ethics of craftsmen. The enemy had adjusted. Good enemies always do. There were new fire sacks, new angles, new ways the rocks could be persuaded to kill you. The force adjusted back, angle for angle. They didn't rush. They unstitched. A captured machine gun found a new employer. A path laid by goats became a file. A small cave that had been a rumor became a staging area where you could count to 5 without anyone trying to grade you. NBY midday. They reached the shoulder of Remitanea. The weather didn't care. It rotated through spite and boredom. A little snow, a little spite again. The plan was the same. Scale down. Appear where you aren't expected. Be quiet until quiet is a disadvantage. Do violence like you're writing a small, neat sentence. Then stop. And again, it worked because everyone kept the promises they'd made to the mountain. We are patient. We are precise. We don't need applause. Below, the valley showed its gratitude in the only currency it owned, movement. Artillery repositioned with the awkward grace of elephants. Engineers shook their heads at problems that had been permanent yesterday, and set about making them temporary. Infantry companies with names that sounded like towns you could grow old in began to inch, then stride. Radios stopped scolding and started coordinating. NBY Nightfall, both peaks, Defensa and Remitania, had new landlords. The line that had been winter itself began to dissolve, not melted by weather, but by work. The force stood down enough to feel the weight return to their knees, and the kind of fatigue set in that feels like someone carefully pouring lead into your coat. The enemy, who had begun the week as inevitability, retreated in good order because that's what professionals do when they cannot win a hill in time to deny a valley. They would be back, somewhere else, in a shape the map would teach new syllables to. But this ground was lost to them, and the loss would cost them everything connected to it. What followed was less dramatic and more important: consolidation. The force handed over positions to fresh units, who looked at the trenches as at a gift and a challenge. They walked their replacements through range cards and dead ground, with the pride of men introducing a friend at a party. They pointed out where the wind lied, where the rocks moved under a man's weight, where the enemy had been almost clever and exactly dangerous. Then, as if remembering they were mortal and not mountain spirits, the forcemen walked back down the way normal soldiers go, legs trembling, hands shaking, faces set in that expression men get when they're not ready to discuss what they just did. Down in the tree line, stoves hissed like friends clearing their throats. Medical tents smelled like alcohol and wool, and a little like victory. Someone brewed coffee strong enough to kick a mule and poured it into tin cups that had seen better manners. End-mail came because the world continues its chores even while history changes shape. A man read a letter about a dog that chased a train and laughed until he had to sit down. Another read about a pipe that had burst in a kitchen on a street where the snowblowers were useless, and he was suddenly home long enough to be tired there. One letter carried a pressed leaf from a tree that had decided to believe in spring, and its green felt like an oath the earth had signed without telling anyone. An photographer showed up with a camera that clicked like a beetle and asked them to stand in a way that would make sense to people in a future where this was a paragraph in a book. They stood as they were, dirty, dented, upright. The camera took their measure and failed, because cameras always fail with men who have moved a map by hand. In recognition has to be rationed like everything else in a war. A general walked through the line and said, "Fine work," like he was handing out bread. A newspaper back home found a headline that made it sound easy because they had to sell papers to people who hadn't climbed anything that day. The enemy found a nickname and spoke it with respect. Black Devils. The men shrugged because a name could not carry what they'd carried. And then the war did what wars do. It moved the spotlight. The force went where hard work made a difference next. Anzio's beaches and breakouts, southern France's hedgerows and high ground, night raids where sleep learned to share. They kept showing up in places where the enemy had been. Certain cliffs were not roads. The myth formed around them, like frost around breath. They treated the myth like bad weather and kept walking. NBUT, the lesson of that first mountain, did not stay up there. It ran downhill, into operations orders and training notes, and the nervous systems of people who would plan the next hard thing. It sat in the sentence a junior officer wrote in his notebook: "Ask the map a ruder question." It lived in the way ordinary infantry looked at impossible angles and thought, maybe not impossible, just impolite. Months later, when the winter line in Italy had been left behind like a bad story told too long, one of the men who had been a private that night stood in a field in southern France and realized the wind smelled like grapes. He wrote home again. He still didn't mention cliffs or grenades or the way a machine gun sounds when it dies. He wrote, "We're making progress. The boys are still good." Years later, after the force had been disbanded because the war decided to end without asking their permission, after men traded blackened faces for office jobs, farms, classrooms, patrol cars, and quiet back porches, the mountain stayed. Veterans returned to regular sizes and weights. Knees remembered. Shoulders wrote their own weather forecasts. In a backyard one autumn, a grandfather held a rope tied to a tree and taught a grandchild a knot that would never slip, and if the child asked why it mattered, he said, "Because sometimes you need to trust what you can tie in the dark." Every war memorial tries to speak for things that cannot be sculpted. Somewhere, a bronze plaque mentions Monte la Defensa in the plain voice stone prefers. People touch the letters, the way you touch names on a door you used to walk through. Tourists read and nod and move on. But there are men who pause longer, not because the type is moving, but because their breath remembers the climb. NIF, you were to stand on that crest today. In kinder weather, you would see a road delivered by men to men. You would feel wind that learned its manners. You would look down at the proper approach and understand the arithmetic of bodies and bullets, and you would be grateful for the rudeness of that black arrow drawn against advice. You might pick up a small, smooth stone and turn it in your fingers and discover that it warms in your hand, which is how you know the world forgives us for asking too much of it now and then. An Underdog Brigade stunned a confident enemy, not by luck, nor by miracle as people use that word, but by competence married to nerve, patience bolted to speed, and an insistence that doctrine bow to terrain when terrain refuses to bow to doctrine. They climbed where you weren't supposed to climb. They arrived where you weren't supposed to arrive. They held what you weren't supposed to hold. And they handed it off to men who could use it to move everything else. History loves to remember the big arrows, but sometimes the arrow is small, almost shy. Sometimes it begins at the foot of a cliff in sleet. Sometimes it is drawn by a pencil in a cold hand. Sometimes it is made of breath. NSO. Let this be the ending that fits. A mountain once said no to every army that asked politely. One night, a small unit asked impolitely, with ropes and resin and the sort of quiet that does not wait for applause. The mountain changed its answer. The line on the map changed its shape. And 1,000 lives, which never learned the names of the men who did it, were allowed to continue their ordinary, beautiful business. NTHAT is how an underdog brigade stunned the enemy. Not in a headline, in a climb, not in a speech, in a series of decisions made with cold hands. Not once, again and again, until the impossible felt like a road, and the road led home. NIF. You ever doubt what small units can do? Look for places where cliffs look like teeth, and the wind thinks it has the only vote. Somewhere on that face, if you listen, you'll hear slow, controlled breathing and the quiet click of a carabiner, and you will know the vote is not yet counted. They climbed. They held. They handed the crest to those who needed it next. And far below, the world began to move because a handful of men, on a winter night, refused to accept the map as printed.